When I first got the assignment to study over-tourism and dispersal, it was part of a broader sustainability project. And we knew we were in for a bit of a challenge with this one because while we'd seen many numbers published before about how excited travelers get about the opportunity to make sustainable decisions, how much they care about their impact on the places they visit, our eyes weren't shut to the state of the world either. And while travelers and research reports were crooning about how much sustainability meant to them, major attractions throughout the world were looking like this, or this, or this. Where are the sustainable decisions there? We knew that we were up against a challenge that researchers have been grappling with for basically forever, which is how do you study a topic when you suspect that your research respondents might not answer truthfully? And when I say not truthfully, I don't mean anybody is maliciously lying and trying to deceive us, more that they have an overly optimistic view about how they'll behave and the types of decisions that they'll make. And there was also a concern about perhaps them not understanding what the definition of sustainable travel even was. So we designed a unique kind of study, one that was blinded in the first half of a survey so that travelers answered questions about their recent decisions, not knowing that they were participating in a sustainability study. This allowed us to compare their perceptions about themselves and how they would think they would act with their actual behaviors, and we definitely saw some differences. We rounded that out with a set of interviews with industry experts. So what did we find? First, in the realm of emotion, in markets across US and major areas in Europe, concerns about over-tourism affecting the future of travel are almost as high about concerns for climate change affecting the future of people's ability to enjoy nature. So the worry is definitely there, and as I mentioned, worry doesn't always translate to action, but people have their eyes on crowds and they're already concerned about the way that they'll affect them. As well, many travelers, up to 45%, also say that they frequently seek out destinations off the beaten path. So some appetite for self-dispersal is already there. Again, don't get too excited about how this one is going to show up in the follow-through, but there is some appeal for visiting secondary destinations. Of the various parts of sustainability I've studied, I have to say that over-tourism is one that I'm a bit more optimistic about remedying. And part of the reason for that is super practical, which is crowds are freaking annoying. They bother people. They're actively detrimental to a trip experience. If you look all the way on the right side of the screen, only 6 to 13% of travelers had avoided a destination in their past 12 months of travel because a destination didn't follow a sustainable practice. This is a really rare decision, including with other types of travel decisions like transportation, accommodation. But meanwhile, 24 to 40% of travelers had decided not to go to a destination because it was too crowded, and to a lesser extent, up to 23% avoided a destination because it was too commercialized. Now, that over-commercialization and overdevelopment also extends to other types of travel decisions. Up to 32% of travelers across markets had avoided a lodging property because the area it was in was too overdeveloped, and up to 34% of travelers had avoided a tour, activity, or attraction for it being overdeveloped. These are numbers that, of course, we want to get up. We want to see them rise, and we'll talk about ways to do that. But as a benchmark, this is not a bad place to start, especially compared to other aspects of sustainability. Now, I, of course, couldn't speak about over-tourism without giving some nod to the fame game, because we've seen places blow up after being featured in TV shows, movies, social media. So what kind of role is fame playing in over-tourism? The answer is it's kind of complicated, because fame doesn't move the needle all on its own. Only up to 23% of travelers had chosen a recent destination because it was famous. It was somewhat more common to choose a tour or activity because the destination was famous for it. So fame isn't moving the needle by itself, but there's a more complicated situation going on here. My take is that choosing a destination or choosing a tour and activity, it's overwhelming. There's so many options of places to go to or things to do. And when a place is top of mind, when it feels more familiar, when you already feel more excited about it, it makes narrowing down your list easier. So fame is playing a role in helping people design their consideration set and to narrow it down, but people aren't status and clout chasers, and we can leverage some of that excitement that people have about these famous destinations in marketing for secondary destinations that we want to encourage dispersal to. I also couldn't speak about fame without giving some mention to social media, and overall, throughout the traveling population, it's not incredibly common to make it a priority to visit places that people saw on social media. The problem happens when you break it down by age, because of course we see that the 18 to 34-year-olds, they're doing this more, and it's especially common in the US. My concern is that some of the places that have blown up because of being featured in social media, they are already really struggling, and they're struggling when the numbers look like this. But social media literacy, it's only going up, and we're only going to see more social media literacy in older age groups as time passes. So if we're having problems when the numbers break down like this, imagine the troubles we would be having if we don't come to grips with this in a future time when all of these bars are equal. This is something that we certainly need to get a handle on. I had mentioned some differences we would see between traveler beliefs and behaviors. Across markets, around half of travelers say that they prefer to visit places that are not very well known, but also less crowded. How does that stack up when it comes to the actual decisions they're making? The truth is, there is a lot of drop-off between what people believe they will do and the actual recent decisions that they made. Only 28% of travelers had stayed in a lesser-known area to avoid crowds on their recent trip. And believe it or not, this was actually one of the better cases of follow-through that we saw across different types of sustainability decisions. The gap is truly pretty wide. Where does the disconnect even come from? How did we get to a situation where people say they're going to do things that they're just truly not doing? Well, one of the things that we were concerned about was awareness of what sustainability is. In this room, I'm sure there are many people who understand, because we're industry insiders, how deep the connection is between overtourism and sustainability. You might know that in places that are overcrowded, destinations have trouble producing enough clean water, or waste management, or being able to provide emergency services for both the resident and traveling populations. But as researchers, we knew this wasn't something that we could assume travelers knew about. So we included a question that gave a long list of sustainable travel measures and asked travelers, which do you personally consider to be ways of traveling sustainably? And I have to emphasize, this was not a trick question. They could have checked every single one, and they would have been correct. But how many knew that self-dispersal, staying in areas off the beaten path, was one method of sustainable travel? Only up to 21%. And I also have to call out that as much as there's been hype about European travelers caring more about sustainability, we're not seeing statistically different levels of awareness about self-dispersal as a method of sustainability between the US and many of these European markets. So the hype that might be true in activism circles or in regulations, it's not actually translating to better traveler awareness. On top of that, only 10 to 12% of travelers knew that booking reserved time entry for parks or attractions was a method of sustainable travel. When we frame it as something that is for crowd management, then we see more buy-in and more willingness to participate in this, but travelers need the dots connected for them. They're not going to automatically understand that reserved entry and crowd management are connected things. Another thing we were concerned about was perceptions of responsibility, because just because a traveler says sustainability is important doesn't mean they're going to take on the personal burden for fixing it. So who do they think is responsible when overcrowding happens? Well, for overcrowding at destinations, they're pretty split across different parties, but it's rare that they believe individual travelers are responsible for this. When we look at overcrowding at attractions, then we see more split between two parties. Either the travel providers or the destination organizations, the DMOs, are the ones they expect need to fix overcrowding at attractions. And when it comes to overdevelopment in destinations, forget about it. This is an issue they see as really a government responsibility and not something that individual travelers should be fixing. What now? Where does that leave us, and how can we leverage this understanding about traveler perceptions and consumer behavior to make headway in fixing overtourism? Well, one of the most practical approaches is to set limits, to set tourist caps on destinations. But what we heard in our industry interviews is that if you want to do this, you better be up for a fight. Because there's a lot of perception that this is something that pits stakeholders against each other. Sometimes you have issues where stakeholders don't understand that certain short-term economic losses translate to long-term benefit, both for their businesses and the destination. Limits need to be calculated carefully to preserve a place as well as possible without causing too much economic detriment to that place. If you're using pricing as a way of stopping people or deterring people from coming into a destination, that price really needs to be set at a place that deters people, because if it's too low, it's not going to present a major barrier. And what we heard as well is that it really helps if the federal government is in your corner if you want to attempt this. Moving away from FOMO culture and towards interest-based trips is important. A lot of trip advice is really quite generalized, and when you give the same advice for what everybody should do, that is a fast recipe for bottlenecked traffic within tourist destinations. And it also might not leave travelers happy if they're getting generalized advice that's not catered to their interests or their passions. It's better for trip satisfaction as well as for dispersal if marketing moves away from exploiting that fear of missing out and fear that they did something wrong if they didn't visit certain places within a destination, and encourages people more to pursue their own interests. This one sounds dangerously simple, but is not frequently being done now on a wide scale. Tourists can't avoid crowded places if they don't know where and when crowds are expected to be. This is something that really needs to be addressed, and there are a lot of marketing materials out there that feature videos or pictures of places when they're empty. They will crop people out. They will Photoshop people out. Social media influencers get called out for this a lot. They'll wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning to take photos of a place at the crack of dawn before anybody has shown up. But it creates a transparency issue where travelers just don't know where to go, where they'll expect crowds and where they won't. Dovetailing off of that, if they know where crowds are, the next thing that tourists will need to disperse is access to information about alternative areas to go instead. They need to get excited about somewhere that's not the primary crowded destination. And this one also sounds dangerously simple, though I'm very aware it's easier said than done. Transportation infrastructure is critical to this. People will gravitate towards places where they have physical access to where they are going. And if the transportation infrastructure isn't set up to take them to secondary or alternative destinations, you won't see a lot of tourists take up on the offer to go to new places. As we'd mentioned, sustainability is a buzzword that perks up people's ears. They understand that it's important. Tourists understand that this is something valuable, but they don't currently understand that overtourism is a piece of that sustainability. So for them to connect the dots when they're planning and making their travel decisions, there needs to be a lot more education around how overtourism is a piece of that sustainability umbrella. Because at the end of the day, we're not just doing this for the sake of travelers. When you fix this issue for travelers, you also make places more livable, because overtourism affects the fabric of cities. It affects the livability of the places that travelers are visiting. But that's a topic that is a bit too big for me to handle all on my own up here on this stage. So we invited a panel of experts to join us to discuss more a win-win for tourism, the ways to balance tourism needs with livability in cities and destinations. So stay in your seats. That panel is coming up next.